I never expected to wage war against a fake homeowners association, but life on my ranch had become anything but predictable. The first sign of trouble came on a crisp October morning as I sipped coffee on my front porch, admiring the sunrise over the rolling hills of my Montana property. 20 acres of freedom, purchased after 15 years of corporate servitude and city living. My slice of the American dream, a rustic ranch house with weathered timber, a barn housing 2 horses, and enough distance from neighbors to play my guitar at midnight without complaint. "Excuse me, sir." The sharp voice cut through the morning tranquility. "You're in violation of community standards." I nearly spilled my coffee as I turned to see a middle-aged woman with aggressively highlighted blonde hair marching up my gravel driveway. She wore a navy blazer with some kind of badge pinned to it, clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Can I help you?" I asked, setting down my mug. "I'm Karren Whitfield, president of the Pine Creek Estates Homeowners Association." She thrust a business card at me. "Your property has several violations that need immediate attention." I took the card, confused. There must be some mistake. This property isn't part of any development or HOA. Karen's thin lips pursed tighter. "All properties in this area fall under our jurisdiction, as of the county rezoning last month. Your fence height exceeds our 4-foot maximum. Your barn color isn't on our approved palette, and that," she pointed disdainfully at my restored 1972 Ford pickup, "needs to be stored in a garage, not visible from the road." "Madam, I bought this land specifically because it had no restrictions. I'm not in any Pine Creek development. The rules have changed, Mr. Steele. Sam Steele." I stood, suddenly aware I was still in my pajama pants, "and I'm going to need to see documentation of this rezoning," she sniffed. "I'll have our enforcement team bring it by tomorrow. In the meantime, you have 72 hours to begin remediation of these violations before fines are assessed." As she turned to leave, I called after her, "This property isn't part of any HOA. I verified that before purchasing." Karren glanced back with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We'll see about that, Mr. Steele." After she left, I immediately called my real estate agent, Marcus, who confirmed what I already knew. My property was unincorporated county land with no HOA attachments possible without my signature. "Sounds fishy, Sam," Marcus said. "I'd call the county assessor's office to verify nothing's changed, but I'm 99% certain this woman is either confused or running some kind of scam." I thanked him and called the county office, where a helpful clerk named Donna confirmed no rezoning had occurred. "We've actually had a few similar reports recently," she added. "Might want to let the sheriff know." Over the next week, I received 3 more visits from Karren or her associates, a nervous-looking man named Doug Fleming, who claimed to be the HOA treasurer, and a younger woman, Melissa Patterson, who introduced herself as their compliance officer. Each time, they presented new violations. My mailbox wasn't regulation. My garden was excessively rustic, and I needed to remove the American flag from my porch because flags were only permitted on designated national holidays. I firmly but politely informed each visitor that I wasn't part of their HOA and had confirmed this with county officials. Each time, they promised to return with documentation that never materialized. Then came the notices, official-looking violation letters slipped under my door or affixed to my mailbox, each threatening escalating fines. I collected them all, documenting each interaction with photos and notes. On day 9 of this bizarre harassment, I returned from grocery shopping to find Karen's white SUV parked in my driveway. As I pulled up beside it, I noticed something unsettling. She had a magnetic door sign that read, Pine Creek HOA Enforcement Division, with an emblem that looked disturbingly similar to the county sheriff's badge. I approached my front door to find Karren and Doug using what appeared to be a lockpick set on my door. My blood ran cold, then immediately boiled. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted, groceries forgotten in my truck. Karren jumped but quickly composed herself. "Mr. Steele, after repeated non-compliance, we're conducting an interior inspection as permitted under Section 8 of the Covenant bylaws. You're breaking into my home." I pulled out my phone. "Step away from the door right now, or I'm calling the sheriff." Doug looked terrified, but Karren held her ground. "This is perfectly legal enforcement of community standards. If you interfere, you'll face additional penalties." I dialed 911 and reported a break-in in progress. Karren and Doug retreated to their vehicle but didn't leave, instead parking at the end of my driveway as if waiting for something. 20 minutes later, Sheriff Ryan Collins arrived, a tall, no-nonsense man I'd met briefly at the local diner when I first moved in. I explained the situation while Karren approached with her clipboard and a folder of documents. "Sheriff, we're simply enforcing covenant restrictions that Mr. Steele agreed to when purchasing this property," she stated confidently. Sheriff Collins looked at her vehicle with the magnetic sign, then at her badge. "Madam, are you claiming to be a government official or law enforcement?" "Of course not. We're a legally constituted homeowners association with enforcement authority granted by May. I see the documentation establishing this HOA's jurisdiction over Mr. Steele's property." The sheriff interrupted. Karren opened her folder and handed over some papers. The sheriff examined them briefly before looking up with narrowed eyes. "These documents appear to be altered county records," he said slowly. "The seal is incorrect, and this signature purported to be from Judge Harmon isn't authentic." The color drained from Doug's face. Karren maintained her composure, though her voice rose slightly. "There must be some mistake. Our attorney provided these. I'd like both of you to come down to the station to sort this out," Sheriff Collins said, his hand now resting casually near his holster. "Mr. Fleming, please step out of the vehicle." What happened next still seems surreal. Karren suddenly threw her clipboard at the sheriff, jumped into her SUV, and attempted to flee, nearly running over Doug in the process. She made it about 50 yards before a deputy who had just arrived blocked the road with his patrol car. The entire scene devolved into chaos, Karren screaming about property values and community standards as she was handcuffed, Doug confessing immediately that he was just doing what Karren told him to, and me standing in my driveway among scattered groceries, watching the bizarre drama unfold. At the sheriff's station, I gave a detailed statement. Sheriff Collins explained that they'd been investigating reports of a fake HOA scam across several rural communities in the county. They target properties just outside legitimate HOA boundaries, hoping owners won't verify or will be intimidated into paying fines. "What would have happened if they got inside my house?" I asked. The sheriff's expression darkened. "Based on what we've found at Karren Whitfield's residence, they likely would have photographed your belongings, claimed additional violations, and possibly taken items as collateral against unpaid fines. In 2 cases, homes were burglarized after owners went on vacation following HOA inspection appointments. I felt violated and angry, but mostly relieved that I'd caught them in the act. What happens next? They'll face charges for attempted burglary, impersonating government officials, forgery of government documents, criminal conspiracy, and possibly racketeering if we can prove a pattern." He handed me his card. "We'll need you to testify if this goes to trial, which I expect it will." I agreed, of course. As I drove home, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. I'd moved to Montana to escape the restrictions of city living, only to be targeted by a fake HOA with real criminal intentions. The next morning, I added a security system to my rustic ranch house. Freedom meant protection, and I wasn't about to let anyone threaten mine again. Later that week, Sheriff Collins called to inform me they'd identified at least 12 other victims of Karren's scheme across 2 counties. Some had paid thousands in fake fines or made expensive, required modifications to their properties. The investigation revealed Karren had previously worked as a real estate paralegal before being fired for falsifying documents, a skill she'd apparently continued to develop. As I hung up the phone, I looked out at my property, my non-HOA, completely free property, and felt a deep appreciation for its unregulated beauty. My horses grazed peacefully in the pasture, my truck sat proudly in the driveway, and my 2-tall fence stood as a monument to personal freedom. The fake HOA ordeal had only begun, though. 2 days after Karren and Doug were arrested, I received a visit from Olivia Kendrick, a journalist from the local newspaper who had caught wind of the story. "Mind if I ask you some questions about your experience with the Pine Creek scam?" she asked, standing on my porch with a small notebook. She was professional, with auburn hair pulled back and intelligent eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they saw. I invited her in, made coffee, and recounted the entire bizarre series of events. As I spoke, Olivia took notes and occasionally asked clarifying questions. "You're not the only victim," she explained. "I've interviewed 3 other homeowners who were targeted. One elderly couple paid over $7,000 in fake fines before their son visited and realized something was wrong." "That's horrible," I said. "Did they get their money back?" Olivia shook her head. "Not yet. The authorities found evidence that Karren Whitfield was transferring funds to offshore accounts. They're still trying to trace it all. How did she even find targets? My property is pretty isolated." "From what I've gathered," Olivia said, "they used county tax records to identify properties just outside legitimate HOA boundaries. Properties like yours, rural, often owned by newcomers to the area who might not know all their neighbors yet. The strategy was clever, I had to admit. As a recent transplant, I hadn't established deep connections in the community. If I hadn't been so certain about my property rights or hadn't verified with the county, I might have believed Karren's confident assertions. There's something else," Olivia added, looking troubled. "Sheriff Collins mentioned they found a list in Karren's home with properties marked for enhanced enforcement. Your address was on it, along with notes about your work schedule and references to your home security or lack thereof." A chill ran down my spine. She was planning to rob me. It appears their operation had escalated from collecting fraudulent fines to actual burglary. The properties on that list shared certain characteristics: rural locations, owners who lived alone, valuable items visible through windows during their inspections. I thought about my guitar collection, vintage vinyl records, and the antique firearms inherited from my grandfather, all easily visible to anyone peering through my windows during their violation assessments. "The sheriff didn't mention that part," I said. "He's been cautious about releasing details while they build their case," Olivia explained. "But I thought you should know the full scope of what you might have prevented by catching them when you did." After Olivia left with her story notes, I reinforced my windows and doors and installed motion sensor lights around the property. The peaceful isolation I'd sought now felt slightly tainted by vulnerability. The next week brought more developments when Sheriff Collins requested I come to the station to identify items recovered from a storage unit, rented under Melissa Patterson's name. The unit contained a disturbing collection: files with personal information on dozens of homeowners, including copies of property tax records, work schedules noted through surveillance, and photographs taken through windows of homes. There were also stolen items: jewelry, electronics, artwork, and documentation for selling these goods through online marketplaces. We believe they used the fake HOA as both a money-making scheme and a way to scout for burglary targets, the sheriff explained. The violation inspections gave them legitimate-seeming access to examine security measures and valuables. Among the recovered items, I recognized an antique pocket watch that belonged to my neighbor Trevor, who lived 3 miles down the road. He'd mentioned a break-in while he was away at his daughter's wedding last month, but hadn't connected it to the HOA visitors he'd received earlier. "How many people were involved in this?" I asked, stunned by the scale of the operation. "We've identified 6 core members so far," Sheriff Collins said. Karren Whitfield was the ringleader. Doug Fleming handled the paperwork and forgeries. Melissa Patterson and 3 others conducted surveillance and some of the break-ins. And they just made up an HOA that doesn't exist. Not entirely. Pine Creek Estates is a real development about 15 miles south of here, with a legitimate HOA. They appropriated the name, modified their bylaws, and created a parallel operation targeting non-HOA properties in the surrounding area. The case grew even more complex when the legitimate Pine Creek Estates HOA president, Martha Jenkins, arrived at the station while I was there. She was horrified to learn that her association's name and reputation had been hijacked for criminal purposes. "We've never had jurisdiction beyond our development's boundaries," she insisted. "And we certainly don't conduct home inspections without proper notice or break into people's homes." The real Pine Creek HOA, it turned out, had been receiving complaints about aggressive enforcement from homeowners they'd never contacted. Martha had initially dismissed these as confusion or neighborhood disputes until Sheriff Collins contacted her about the investigation. "The real damage here goes beyond the thefts," Martha said. "This undermines legitimate homeowners associations that serve their communities properly. We're not all power-hungry dictators, you know." I bit my tongue. Having specifically chosen property outside any HOA jurisdiction to avoid restrictive covenants. This wasn't the time to debate the merits of community governance versus property freedom. As the investigation continued, more victims came forward. Some had paid thousands in fraudulent fines. Others had made expensive modifications to their properties based on fake requirements. A few, like me, had caught on quickly and resisted. The most troubling cases involved homes that had been burglarized after inspections identified valuable items and security weaknesses. 2 weeks after the initial arrests, I received a call from the district attorney's office. Karren Whitfield had been denied bail due to flight risk. Those offshore accounts suggested preparation for eventual escape, and the prosecutor wanted to discuss my testimony for the upcoming preliminary hearing. The criminal case was only part of the aftermath. Civil lawsuits began mounting against Karren and her accomplices, with victims seeking to recover their losses. The legitimate Pine Creek Estates HOA also filed suit for defamation and misappropriation of their name and documents. Throughout all this legal activity, I continued my quiet life on the ranch, though with enhanced security and a new wariness about unexpected visitors. The case had made the regional news, with Olivia's detailed reporting bringing attention to the scope of the scam. She'd come by several more times for follow-up interviews, and I found myself looking forward to her visits. She was easy to talk to, and her outrage on behalf of the victims seemed genuine. One evening, as I was feeding the horses, Sheriff Collins's patrol car came up the driveway. This had become a somewhat regular occurrence as he provided updates on the case, but his expression today was more serious than usual. "Evening, Sam," he said, declining my offer of coffee. "I wanted to give you a heads up personally before you hear it elsewhere. We've had a development in the case." "What kind of development?" "Karren Whitfield's husband, Thomas, was arrested this morning. Turns out he was more involved than we initially thought. He's a former IT specialist who helped them access property records and set up the fake documentation." The sheriff hesitated. "There's something else. We found detailed plans for your property specifically, floor plans, notes about entry points, security weaknesses." My stomach tightened. "Why target me so specifically?" "Your guitar collection," he said simply. "Karen's husband is apparently quite knowledgeable about vintage instruments. During one of their inspection visits, they photographed your collection through the window. Thomas identified several as highly valuable." I glanced toward my home studio, where my prized 1959 Gibson Les Paul, inherited from my father and worth well over $200,000, hung alongside other vintage instruments I'd collected over the years. "We believe they were planning a significant theft here," Sheriff Collins continued. "The notes suggest they intended to return when you took that fishing trip you mentioned to Melissa during one of her visits." I remembered the conversation. Melissa had seemed genuinely interested in fly fishing, and I'd mentioned my upcoming weekend trip to the Madison River. I'd almost invited her to join me, finding her enthusiasm for the sport convincing. The realization that this had been calculated reconnaissance made me feel foolish and violated. "There's one more thing you should be aware of," the sheriff added. "Thomas Whitfield hasn't been cooperative, but Karren is now offering information in exchange for consideration at sentencing. She's implicated Olivia Kendrick in the scheme." "Olivia, the reporter?" I couldn't hide my shock. "That's ridiculous. She's been covering the story, helping expose them." Sheriff Collins looked uncomfortable. "We're investigating the claim. Karren alleges Olivia was meant to gather additional information about victims and their valuables through her interviews. She would gain access as a trusted journalist where HOA representatives might be turned away." "I don't believe it," I said firmly. "Karren's obviously trying to cause trouble, maybe discredit the reporting." "Possibly," the sheriff conceded, "but we have to follow up on all leads. I'd advise caution about sharing any personal information until we've cleared this up." After he left, I sat on my porch swing, watching the sunset and trying to process this new information. Could Olivia really be part of the scam? She'd seemed genuinely outraged by the fake HOA's actions. She'd been thorough and professional in her reporting. But then again, so had Karren when playing the role of HOA president. I called Trevor, my neighbor who'd had items stolen, and asked if he'd been interviewed by Olivia. He confirmed she'd visited twice, once for the initial story and again for a follow-up about the recovered items. "Did she seem particularly interested in your home security or valuables?" I asked as casually as possible. "Not really," Trevor replied, "though she did ask if I'd made any security changes since the break-in. I figured that was just relevant to the story angle about community responses." The conversation left me unsettled but unconvinced of Olivia's involvement. My instinct still said Karren was lying to cause confusion or gain leverage. Nevertheless, I found myself checking the locks twice that night and glancing at my guitar collection with new concern. The following morning, I called the newspaper where Olivia worked, only to learn she'd taken a few days of personal leave. This timing, right after Karren's allegations, seemed suspicious. I left a message asking her to call me. She didn't call back that day, or the next. By the third day, my doubts were growing despite myself. I decided to drive into town to the newspaper office, hoping to learn more. The editor, an older man named Frank Wheeler, looked uncomfortable when I asked about Olivia. "She's on leave dealing with a family matter," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Is that the only reason?" I pressed. "I heard there might be some questions about her involvement in the story she's been covering." Frank sighed heavily. "Look, I've known Olivia for 5 years. She's one of my best reporters. These allegations blindsided all of us. She's cooperating fully with the investigation, but she's also pretty devastated that anyone would believe she could be involved in something like this. So you don't think there's any truth to it?" "I'd bet my retirement fund there isn't," Frank said firmly. "But the paper has to maintain objectivity while this plays out, which is why she's taking some time off. The last thing we need is for her continued reporting to be viewed as compromised." I left feeling slightly reassured, but still troubled. On the drive home, I stopped at the local hardware store for some additional security cameras I'd been meaning to install. As I browsed the selection, a voice behind me said, "The wireless ones are easier to install, but the wired versions are more reliable." I turned to find Olivia standing there, looking tired and tense. Her usual professional demeanor was replaced by something more vulnerable. "Olivia," I said, surprised, "I've been trying to reach you. I know. I saw your messages." She glanced around the store before continuing. "I'm guessing Sheriff Collins told you about Karren's claims." "He did. I told him I didn't believe it." A flash of relief crossed her face. "Thank you for that. Not everyone's been so generous. Mind if we talk?" "Not here." We drove separately to a small cafe on the outskirts of town, where Olivia chose a table in the back corner, away from other patrons. She seemed hyper-aware of our surroundings, checking the door each time it opened. "I'm not part of their scheme," she said immediately after we sat down. "Karren is trying to muddy the waters and create reasonable doubt by implicating as many people as possible." "Why target you specifically?" "Because I've been effective," Olivia said with a hint of professional pride. "My reporting has helped identify additional victims and connected dots the authorities might have missed. Karren knows my articles are strengthening the case against her." Her explanation made sense, but there was clearly more she wasn't saying. "There's something else, isn't there?" I pressed. Olivia stared into her coffee cup for a long moment before responding. "Karren and I have history. I wrote an exposé 3 years ago about a real estate scam she was running at her previous job. She wasn't charged, insufficient evidence, but she was fired. She's had a vendetta against me ever since." "You never mentioned this in your coverage of the HOA scam," I pointed out. "I disclosed it to my editor, and we agreed another reporter should handle any direct references to Karren's background to avoid any appearance of bias. But I continued investigating the broader story because I had relevant expertise." She looked up at me. "I should have told you when we first spoke. I just didn't want it to seem like I had a personal stake in the story." The waitress brought our food, and we ate in silence for a few minutes as I processed this new information. It added a layer of complexity to the situation, but also made Karren's accusation seem more like retaliation than truth. "There's one more thing you should know," Olivia finally said. "The sheriff's office found emails between Karren and someone who appears to have been feeding her information about potential targets. They haven't identified this person yet, but there are references to someone at the local title company who helped them identify properties without HOA restrictions." "You think that's why Karren accused you? To divert attention from her real accomplice?" "Possibly. Or maybe she's just throwing accusations at anyone who's been effective against her," Either way, I've been temporarily sidelined from the biggest story of my career. Her frustration was evident. As we finished our meal, Olivia hesitated before asking, "Do you really have a 1959 Les Paul? I noticed it in your studio when I interviewed you, but I didn't realize what it was at the time." My guard instantly went up. "Why do you ask?" She must have noticed my changed demeanor because she quickly added, "My brother is a guitarist. He's always talking about vintage instruments. When Karren mentioned targeting you specifically for your guitar collection, it clicked what I'd seen in your home." The explanation seemed reasonable, but the timing of the question still bothered me. Yes, it was my father's, one of the few things I have from him. "You should make sure it's properly insured and documented," she said. "If they were targeting it specifically, others might too." I nodded noncommittally, paid for our meals, and we walked to our separate vehicles. As I drove home, I found myself analyzing every conversation I'd ever had with Olivia, looking for signs I might have missed. Her explanation about her history with Karren made sense, but her question about the guitar had raised new doubts. That evening, I moved my most valuable guitars into a hidden storage area I'd built into the ranch house, a panic room of sorts that wasn't visible on the property's floor plan. As I secured the instruments, I wondered if I was being paranoid or prudent. The preliminary hearing for Karren, Doug, and the others was scheduled for the following week. I was called to testify about the attempted break-in I'd witnessed. As I entered the courthouse, I saw Olivia in the gallery, notebook in hand, clearly back on the job. Our eyes met briefly, and she gave me a small nod of encouragement. My testimony was straightforward. I recounted finding Karren and Doug attempting to pick my front door lock, their claims about HOA inspection rights, and the confrontation that followed. The prosecutor had me identify the fake documents they'd presented to Sheriff Collins and verify that I'd never signed any HOA agreement. During cross-examination, Karren's defense attorney tried to suggest I might have misunderstood what was happening. "Isn't it possible my client was simply checking if your door was secured properly as part of a community safety initiative with lockpicks?" I responded, drawing a few chuckles from the gallery and a frown from the judge. "Mr. Steele, please just answer the questions directly," the judge admonished. "No, it's not possible," I amended. "They were clearly attempting to gain unauthorized access to my home." After my testimony, I remained for the rest of the day's proceedings. Sheriff Collins presented evidence from the storage unit, including the list of targeted properties and stolen items. When he mentioned finding detailed plans for my home and notes about my guitar collection, I noticed Olivia watching me with concern. The most damning testimony came from Doug Fleming, who had accepted a plea deal in exchange for his cooperation. He methodically outlined the entire operation: how they selected targets, created fake documents, conducted inspections to scout for valuables, and eventually graduated from collecting fraudulent fines to outright burglary. "It was Karren's idea from the start," Doug testified. "She said homeowners are conditioned to obey HOA rules without question. Most people hate confrontation so much they'll pay fines even when they're suspicious, just to avoid the hassle of fighting it." When asked about Olivia's alleged involvement, Doug looked genuinely confused. The reporter: "No, she wasn't part of our operation. Karren hated her because of some article she wrote years ago. She was always complaining that the woman had ruined her career once before and was doing it again." By the end of the preliminary hearing, the judge found sufficient evidence to proceed to trial on all charges. Karren, her husband Thomas, and 2 others were held without bail. Doug and Melissa, who had cooperated, were granted bail with monitoring. As I left the courthouse, Olivia fell into step beside me. "Vindication feels good," she said quietly. "I'm sorry I doubted you," I admitted. "Don't be. Healthy skepticism is appropriate after what you've been through." She hesitated. "I'm working on a follow-up piece about how this case exposes vulnerabilities in our assumptions about authority. Would you be willing to be interviewed again?" I agreed, but suggested meeting somewhere public rather than my home, a boundary that she respected without offense. Over the next few months, the case worked its way through the legal system. More victims came forward as news of the scam spread and the charges multiplied. The mysterious insider at the title company was identified as a clerk named Victor Lawson, who had been selling information to Karren for a cut of the proceeds. Throughout this time, I upgraded my home security, became more involved in the local community to build genuine connections with neighbors, and even started a support group for victims of the fake HOA scam. The experience had shaken my faith in the privacy and freedom I thought my remote property provided, but it had also integrated me into the community in ways I hadn't expected. Olivia's series of articles won a regional journalism award and led to proposed legislation requiring stricter verification processes for HOA documentation at the county level. We developed a friendship of sorts, bound by the strange circumstances that had brought us together. I'd even invited her to one of the small concerts I occasionally hosted in my barn for neighbors and friends, where I played some of my prized vintage guitars. The trial finally began nearly a year after Karren and Doug had attempted to break into my home. The evidence was overwhelming, with documentation of their entire operation seized from multiple locations, testimony from victims, and the cooperating defendants' accounts of how the scheme worked. Karren maintained her innocence throughout, alternating between claiming she believed she had legitimate authority and accusing others of masterminding the operation. Her husband, Thomas, eventually accepted a plea deal and testified against her, revealing that the scam had begun after their legitimate real estate investments collapsed during the recession. They'd started with small fines levied against uninformed homeowners, then escalated as they realized how lucrative the deception could be. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Karren Whitfield was sentenced to 15 years for multiple felonies, including burglary, fraud, forgery, and criminal conspiracy. Her husband received 8 years. The others received sentences ranging from probation to 7 years, depending on their level of involvement and cooperation. After the sentencing, Sheriff Collins approached me outside the courthouse. "Thought you'd like to know we've recovered most of the stolen items, including your neighbor Trevor's pocket watch. The civil suits are proceeding to help victims recover their financial losses." "What about the money people paid in fake fines?" I asked. "Some of it was recovered from their accounts, but much was already spent. The court has ordered restitution as part of the sentencing." He shook his head. "The real tragedy is how easily they manipulated people's respect for rules and authority to victimize them." "That's the real lesson here," Olivia added, joining our conversation. "People are conditioned to comply with official-looking documents and badges, even when their instincts tell them something's wrong. I guess I'm fortunate my instinct was stubborn resistance to authority," I joked. Sheriff Collins laughed. "In this case, that served you well. Just don't apply that attitude next time I pull you over for speeding." As the crowd dispersed, Olivia and I walked toward the parking lot. "So what's next?" I asked her. "Now that the big story is wrapped up with a neat conviction bow." "There's always another story," she replied. but I've been thinking about expanding this into a book, exploring how the fake HOA scam exposes broader issues about authority, community governance, and our assumptions about neighbors. Sounds fascinating. Just promise not to make me the grumpy hermit character who distrusts everyone. Too late, she teased. But don't worry, your character development arc is quite satisfying. The isolated rancher who helps bring down a criminal operation and builds community connections in the process. We reached my truck, and I hesitated before asking, "Would you like to come by the ranch this weekend? I'm hosting another small gathering. Nothing fancy, just music, food, and neighbors getting to know each other better." "I'd like that," she said with a smile. And I promise not to take notes this time. As I drove home along the familiar winding road to my ranch, I reflected on the strange journey of the past year. What had begun as a disturbing violation of my property and privacy had transformed into something unexpected: stronger connections to my community, new friendships, and a deeper appreciation for the genuine neighborly relationships that had no need for enforcement committees or compliance officers. My ranch stood as I'd always envisioned it, a place of freedom and personal expression, with the too tall fence and barn painted in non-approved colors. But now, it was also something more: a gathering place for a community that had come together in the wake of a shared threat. I parked beside my 1972 Ford pickup, still proudly displayed in my driveway, where no legitimate HOA could ever demand its removal, and walked toward my front door. The security system recognized me and disarmed automatically, a modern concession to the lessons learned. Inside, I checked on my guitars, now returned to their proper display after the trial's conclusion. The 1959 Les Paul gleamed under the studio lights, a family legacy that had nearly been lost to greed. I picked it up and played a few chords, the rich tone filling the room as the sun set over my property, my rules, my home, my community. Just the way it should be. The fake HOA had taught me the value of vigilance, but also the importance of connection. In trying to isolate and victimize homeowners through false authority, Karren Whitfield had inadvertently created something powerful: a neighborhood that now looked out for one another. No covenant required.